I stared at the termination letter clutched in my trembling hands. 10 years of building the most sophisticated construction payroll system in the region reduced to 3 words: redundant due to modernization. My wife's Uncle Frank had just delivered the devastating news that his MBA son Bradley would replace my entire operation with an Excel spreadsheet. As I watched Bradley smugly examining my workstation, adjusting my ergonomic chair, with the confidence of someone who had never processed a single construction paycheck, I realized 16,000 workers across 5 states would depend on his untested system by Monday morning. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him, but his arrogant smirk told me he had no idea what storm was coming. 2 hours after receiving my termination notice, I sat in my office for what Frank insisted would be the last time watching my professional world crumble around me. The irony was suffocating. I had transformed this company from a chaotic mess of handwritten timesheets and calculator errors into a streamlined operation that could handle the complexities of multi-state construction payroll with precision that impressed even federal auditors. When I started here a decade ago, Brookstone Construction was hemorrhaging money through payroll mistakes. Frank's previous system consisted of his secretary, Sarah, entering numbers into a basic accounting program, resulting in constant errors, missed deadlines, and furious workers demanding their correct wages. I had just graduated with my degree in accounting and business management, eager to prove myself in a male-dominated industry. Those early years were brutal. I spent countless nights learning the intricate web of construction payroll regulations. Union agreements varied by trade and location. Prevailing wage rates changed constantly on government projects. Over time, calculations became nightmares when workers moved between different job classifications within the same week. Health insurance contributions, pension funds, training fees, and apprenticeship programs all required separate tracking and reporting. I built custom databases that integrated with time tracking systems, created automated compliance checks, and developed reporting tools that could handle everything from Department of Labor audits to union grievance investigations. My system processed payments for carpenters, electricians, plumbers, heavy equipment, operators, laborers, and specialized trades across Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Each state had different tax requirements, worker compensation rules, and regulatory reporting deadlines. Bradley waltzed into my office carrying a laptop and wearing the kind of confident expression that only comes from never having failed at anything important. His navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, his brown hair styled with expensive product, and his leather portfolio looked like it had never been opened. At 26, he possessed his father's square jawline and his grandfather's stubborn streak, but none of the wisdom that comes from actually running a business. "Celeste, right?" he said, not waiting for confirmation as he set his laptop on my desk. "Dad told me you've been handling the number crunching here. I appreciate all the work you've done, but honestly, this whole operation seems way more complicated than it needs to be." I gestured toward this wall where I had mounted flowcharts showing our payroll process. "Bradley, this isn't just number crunching. We're dealing with 16,000 active workers across 5 states. Each one has different union affiliations, benefit packages, and tax situations. The prevailing wage rates alone require constant monitoring of federal, state, and local regulations." He barely glanced at my charts. "See, that's exactly what I mean. You're overthinking this. Payroll is payroll. Hours times rate equals gross pay, subtract taxes and deductions, cut checks." I managed payroll for 3 retail locations during my internship. We had 200 employees, and I handled everything in Excel. My assistant Jenny knocked on the doorframe, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious concern. She had worked alongside me for 5 years, learning the intricacies of construction payroll and developing genuine expertise in areas like apprenticeship tracking and union reporting. Her curly red hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes reflected the same disbelief I was feeling. "Celeste Marcus from Local 407 is here for your weekly compliance meeting," she announced, then lowered her voice. "Should I tell him about the changes?" Before I could respond, Bradley stood up and extended his hand toward the doorway. "Marcus, right, I'm Bradley, the new payroll manager. I'll be taking over all operations starting Monday." Marcus Williams stepped into the office, his weathered face showing immediate suspicion. At 52, he had spent 3 decades representing electrical workers and had seen plenty of management changes that ended badly for his members. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his union jacket bore pins from various labor conventions and political campaigns. "Taking over from Celeste?" Marcus asked, his deep voice carrying a note of disbelief. "She's been running the smoothest payroll operation in the region. Our members actually get paid correctly and on time. That's pretty rare in this business." Bradley's smile never wavered. "I appreciate the compliment, but I think we can streamline things significantly. I've designed a new system that eliminates a lot of unnecessary complexity. My MBA program emphasized efficiency and cost reduction. Sometimes you need fresh eyes to see opportunities for improvement." Marcus looked at me, then back at Bradley. "What kind of experience do you have with construction payroll union agreements, prevailing wage calculations?" "Well, I haven't worked specifically in construction," Bradley admitted, "but payroll fundamentals are universal. Plus, my retail experience included managing multiple locations with different tax jurisdictions. Really, the principles are the same." I watched Marcus's expression shift from suspicion to alarm. "Celeste, are you okay with this transition? Because if there are going to be problems with member payments or benefit contributions, I need to know now." "Marcus, I'm not okay with any of this," I said honestly. "But the decision has been made. Bradley will be taking over with 0 transition period. My access gets cut off at 5 o'clock today." Jenny's face went pale. "Today? But what about the prevailing wage report that's due Tuesday, and the apprenticeship contributions for this quarter? Celeste, you're the only one who knows how to generate those reports." Bradley waved dismissively. "Look, I'm sure there's documentation somewhere. How hard can it be? You input the data, run the calculations, submit the forms. I'll figure it out over the weekend." Marcus stood up abruptly. "This is insane. Celeste handles payroll for thousands of our members across multiple locals. She knows every agreement, every rate schedule, every reporting requirement. You're telling me someone with no construction experience is taking over with no training?" "Marcus, I understand your concern," Bradley replied, his tone becoming slightly condescending. "But sometimes change is difficult to accept. My educational background has prepared me to handle complex systems. I'm confident that within a few weeks, I'll have everything running more efficiently than before." The climactic moment arrived when Frank appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance. At 61, he still carried himself like the former Marine he was, but his gray hair and tired eyes showed the weight of running a multi-million-dollar operation. He looked around the room, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he was walking into. "Everything going smoothly in here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Frank," Marcus said immediately, "I need to understand exactly what's happening here. Are you really replacing Celeste with someone who has no construction payroll experience? Because if my members don't get paid correctly, this becomes a very serious legal issue very quickly." Frank's jaw tightened. "Bradley is my son, and he's got the education and skills to modernize our operations. Celeste has done good work, but it's time to move forward with more efficient systems." I felt something break inside me. Frank, efficient systems don't work if they don't actually function. Construction payroll isn't like retail payroll. When you mess up a construction worker's pay, you're not just dealing with an annoyed employee, you're dealing with union grievances, Department of Labor violations, and federal compliance issues. "Celeste, I appreciate your concerns," Frank said, "but the decision is final. Bradley starts Monday morning with full authority over payroll operations. All of your system access will be terminated at the end of business today." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Frank, I've got to tell you, this feels like a disaster waiting to happen. Our contract requires accurate and timely payment of wages and benefits. If there are problems, the union will have no choice but to take action." Bradley laughed confidently. "Marcus, I think you're underestimating my capabilities. Give me a chance to prove that fresh thinking can improve your members' experience." As Marcus and Jenny left the office, both shaking their heads in disbelief, I realized Frank had made a decision that would haunt everyone involved. Bradley had no idea what he was walking into, and Frank was too proud to admit he might be making a catastrophic mistake. The foundation I had spent 10 years building was about to crumble, and 16,000 workers would pay the price for Frank's stubborn refusal to value expertise over family loyalty. Monday morning arrived with the force of an avalanche nobody saw coming. I sat in my car across the street from Brookstone Construction's headquarters, watching through the large windows as Bradley confidently strutted around my former office. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but I couldn't leave. 10 years of my life's work was about to be destroyed by someone who thought construction payroll was no different from retail scheduling. My phone started ringing at 7:30 in the morning. Diana Chen, my former colleague from the accounting department, whispered frantically into her phone from the office bathroom. "Celeste, this is already a nightmare," Diana hissed. "Bradley came in this morning acting like he owned the place. He deleted half the formulas in the main spreadsheet because he said they were unnecessarily complicated. When I tried to explain that those formulas calculate hazard pay differentials for high-rise work, he told me I was overthinking things." Diana had worked in general accounting for 8 years, but had learned enough about construction payroll to help during busy periods. Her attention to detail and cautious nature made her invaluable during audit season. Now she was watching years of careful work being dismantled by someone who couldn't distinguish between a carpenter's apprentice and a journeyman electrician. "What about the tax withholdings?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "He's using standard percentages across the board. No adjustments for union dues, no separate calculations for different locals, no consideration for workers who live in different states than where they're working. Celeste, he's treating everyone like they're hourly retail employees." My stomach dropped. Interstate construction workers faced incredibly complex tax situations. A carpenter who lived in Michigan but worked on a project in Indiana needed different withholdings than someone doing the same job who lived in Illinois. Union dues varied by local, and benefit contributions had to be calculated separately for each trade organization. "Diana, what about overtime calculations?" "That's even worse. He's using straight time and a half for anything over 40 hours. He has no idea that different trades have different overtime rules, or that prevailing wage jobs have separate overtime rates, or that some union agreements require double time on Sundays." I closed my eyes, knowing this was just the beginning. Bradley was making fundamental errors that would compound throughout the week. By Friday, the mistakes would be so embedded in the system that fixing them would require rebuilding everything from scratch. Tony Rizzo called me at 9:15. As site foreman for our biggest high-rise project in downtown Detroit, Tony managed a crew of 47 specialized workers, including crane operators, iron workers, and concrete finishers. His gravelly voice carried 30 years of construction experience and zero tolerance for management incompetence. "Celeste, what the hell is going on over there? My crane operators are telling me their paychecks are wrong. These guys make $28 an hour base rate plus $15 hazard pay for working above 200 feet. Their checks show straight $28 with no hazard differential." Tony Frank replaced me with his son Bradley. "He's trying to simplify the payroll system." "Simplify?" Tony's voice rose. "Celeste, hazard pay isn't optional. It's written into every high-rise contract in the city. If my crane operators don't get their full rate, they walk off the job. I can't complete this project without crane support." "I know, Tony. I tried to warn them, but Frank wouldn't listen." "This is insane. These guys are working 300 feet in the air, and some MBA kid thinks their pay is too complicated, Celeste. If this doesn't get fixed by Wednesday, I'm going to have a full crew revolt on my hands." After Tony hung up, I received a call from Sandra Mitchell, the Department of Labor investigator, who was scheduled to arrive Thursday for Brookstone's quarterly audit. Sandra had worked federal labor compliance for 15 years and knew construction regulations better than most lawyers. "Celeste, I'm calling to confirm our audit appointment for Thursday morning. I'll need to review the prevailing wage documentation for the federal projects union reporting compliance and overtime calculation procedures." My heart sank. "Sandra, I'm not with Brookstone anymore. You'll need to work with Bradley Hoffman, the new payroll manager." "What happened to you?" Sandra asked, surprised. "Your operation was always one of the cleanest I audited. Everything properly documented, calculations, accurate reporting submitted on time. Frank decided to modernize with someone who has fresh ideas about payroll efficiency." Sandra was quiet for several seconds. "Celeste, I hope this new person understands that our audit covers 3 federal projects worth $12 million in combined contracts. If we find prevailing wage violations or improper overtime calculations, we're talking about potential criminal referrals, not just administrative fines." I tried to explain that, but the decision was final. "Well, I guess I'll find out Thursday morning what fresh ideas look like in practice." By noon, Diana called again, this time from her car during lunch break. "Celeste, Bradley just had his first meeting with Frank, and it's clear he's already in over his head. Frank asked about the union contribution reports that are due Wednesday, and Bradley had no idea what he was talking about. He asked me to explain how union dues work." "What did you tell him?" "I tried to explain that each trade has different locals with different dues structures, and that we have to track apprenticeship contributions separately from general dues, and that some workers belong to multiple unions depending on their job classification. His eyes just glazed over. Then he asked if we could just use a standard percentage for everyone. Diana's voice carried genuine fear. Celeste, he doesn't understand that we're dealing with teamsters, electrical workers, carpenters, laborers, and operating engineers. Each one has different contracts, different benefit packages, different political action fund contributions. You can't just apply retail payroll logic to this. At 2 o'clock, Marcus called with barely controlled anger. Celeste, I just got off the phone with 3 different locals and they're all reporting the same problems. Members are missing union dues deductions, apprenticeship contributions are wrong, and benefit fund payments aren't being calculated correctly. This isn't just about individual paychecks anymore. This is about federal compliance and union contract violations. Marcus, how bad is it? Bad enough that I'm scheduling an emergency meeting with our legal team for tomorrow morning. If Brookstone can't process payroll correctly, we're looking at contract violations that could shut down their federal projects. Celeste, we're talking about potential lawsuits that could bankrupt the company. The climactic moment came when Diana called me at 4:30, speaking in hushed, panicked tones. Celeste, you're not going to believe this. Bradley just discovered that the government projects have something called Davis-Bacon wage requirements, and he's been calculating them wrong all week. Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rates were federal requirements for any government-funded construction project. Contractors had to pay workers specific minimum wages that varied by location, trade, and project type. Violations weren't just administrative errors. They were federal crimes that could result in criminal charges for company executives. Diana, what exactly did he do wrong? He's been using regular union rates instead of prevailing wage rates. On the courthouse project, electricians are supposed to get $34.50 per hour prevailing wage, but he's been paying them $29 union rate. That's a $5.50 difference for every hour worked. Multiply that by 40 electricians working 50 hours each, and we're talking about $11,000 in underpayment just for one trade on one project. Diana, that's a willful violation of federal wage laws. The Department of Labor doesn't treat those as honest mistakes. It gets worse. He's made the same error on 3 different federal projects. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in underpayments plus penalties, plus potential criminal charges for the company. As I sat in my car watching the sun set behind Brookstone's office building, I realized that Frank's decision to replace experience with education was about to destroy everything he had spent decades building. Bradley's confidence had blinded him to complexities he couldn't even comprehend, and 16,000 workers were about to pay the price for his arrogance. The perfect storm was gathering strength, and by Thursday morning, Sandra's audit would expose the full magnitude of the disaster Frank had created by choosing family loyalty over professional competence. Tuesday morning brought a deluge of problems that turned Bradley's confident predictions into a nightmare of federal violations and union fury. I watched from my coffee shop across the street as emergency vehicles filled Brookstone's parking lot, not because of any physical emergency, but because the legal crisis had reached a level that required immediate intervention. Marcus arrived at 7 in the morning with 2 other union representatives and an attorney. Their grim expressions and urgent pace told me the situation had escalated beyond simple payroll errors. These weren't routine complaints about minor calculation mistakes. This was a full-scale labor crisis that threatened to shut down operations across 5 states. Diana managed to call me during her morning break, speaking quickly and quietly. Celeste Local 407 filed formal grievances against 3 federal projects this morning. They're claiming willful wage theft under the Service Contract Act. Marcus brought lawyers who are talking about immediate work stoppages and federal criminal referrals. How is Bradley handling it? He's completely lost. Frank called an emergency meeting at 8, and Bradley spent 20 minutes trying to explain that his calculations were essentially correct and that the unions were overreacting. When Marcus showed him the actual prevailing wage schedules, Bradley said he thought those were suggested rates instead of federal requirements. The magnitude of Bradley's ignorance was staggering. Prevailing wage rates weren't suggestions, they were legally mandated minimums, established by the Department of Labor for all federal construction projects. Paying below those rates was a federal crime that could result in criminal prosecution of company executives. Sandra Mitchell arrived at Brookstone 3 hours earlier than scheduled, accompanied by 2 other Department of Labor investigators. Their unannounced appearance sent panic throughout the office as employees realized the quarterly audit had become a full investigation into potential federal crimes. I received a call from Tony at the Detroit high-rise site where the crisis had reached a breaking point. Celeste, my crane operators walked off the job this morning. They're not just missing hazard pay, their overtime calculations are completely wrong. These guys worked 62 hours last week, and their paychecks show 55 hours at regular overtime rates. Tony, what about the specialized rates for weekend work? That's another problem. Saturday work is supposed to be time and a half, Sunday work is double time, and holiday work is triple time. This MBA genius calculated everything at straight time and a half. My guys are missing thousands of dollars each, and they're talking about filing complaints with the state labor board. Tony's voice carried genuine desperation. Celeste, I've got a $12 million project that's supposed to be completed by Christmas. Without crane operators, everything stops. The concrete pours are backed up, the steel installation is behind schedule, and the client is threatening to cancel the contract. By noon, the crisis had spread to projects in 3 other states. Site supervisors in Ohio reported that operating engineers were threatening work stoppages over incorrect benefit calculations. Heavy equipment operators in Illinois discovered their pension contributions had been calculated incorrectly, potentially affecting their retirement benefits. In Indiana, carpenters found their apprenticeship fund contributions were missing, entirely violating training program requirements that were written into their union contracts. Diana called again during lunch, this time from her car in the parking lot. Celeste, Sandra just finished reviewing the federal project files, and she looks absolutely furious. She spent 2 hours going through prevailing wage calculations, and Bradley kept trying to defend his mistakes by saying he was optimizing for efficiency. What was Sandra's response? She told him that efficiency doesn't matter if the calculations violate federal law. Then she asked him if he understood that willful wage theft is a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. Bradley went completely white and started stammering about honest mistakes and learning curves. The climactic moment arrived when Sandra informed Frank that the violations were so extensive and systematic that she was recommending immediate federal investigation with potential criminal charges. The conversation took place in Frank's office, but Diana could hear raised voices through the walls. Celeste, Sandra told Frank that the prevailing wage violations alone could result in fines exceeding $2 million, but she said the willful nature of the violations suggests criminal intent, which means Frank could face personal prosecution under federal racketeering statutes. Frank had spent 40 years building Brookstone Construction from a small family business into a major regional contractor. The possibility of criminal charges threatened not just his company, but his personal freedom and family legacy. What did Frank say? He started yelling at Bradley, demanding to know how someone with an MBA could make such fundamental errors. Bradley tried to blame you, saying the previous system was too complicated and didn't include proper documentation. Sandra interrupted him and said she had reviewed your historical files, and they were the most comprehensive and accurate she had ever seen. By 3 o'clock, the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. Marcus called to inform me that Local 407 was voting on immediate work stoppages across all Brookstone projects. Celeste, our members can't afford to work for a company that doesn't pay them correctly. We're talking about potential strikes affecting over 3,000 workers across 5 states. Marcus, is there any possibility of resolving this without work stoppages? Not unless Frank fixes the payroll system immediately. But your replacement clearly can't handle the job, and Frank seems unwilling to admit his mistake. Our lawyers are advising that we have no choice but to protect our members through immediate action. The local news picked up the story by evening, with reporters interviewing workers who hadn't received correct paychecks. Channel 7 ran a segment titled, "Construction Giant Faces Federal Investigation Over Worker Pay," featuring interviews with crane operators, electricians and carpenters who described missing wages and incorrect benefit calculations. The reporter interviewed Marcus outside Brookstone's headquarters. "This situation represents a fundamental failure of management," Marcus stated. "These workers depend on accurate paychecks to support their families. When a company can't perform basic payroll functions, it raises serious questions about their competence to handle federal construction projects." Diana sent me a text message after the news broadcast. Frank watched the whole thing in his office. He looked like someone had died. Bradley tried to convince him that the media was exaggerating the problems, but Frank just stared out the window without saying anything. The final blow came when Pinnacle Development, Brookstone's largest client, called an emergency meeting for Wednesday morning to discuss the payroll crisis. Pinnacle had 3 major projects under construction, representing over $50 million in combined contracts. Their reputation depended on working with reliable contractors who could manage complex operations without creating legal complications. As Tuesday night approached, I realized that Frank's decision to replace professional expertise with family connections had created a disaster that threatened the survival of his company. Bradley's MBA confidence had collided with the reality of federal construction regulations, and the resulting chaos would take months to resolve if it could be resolved at all. 16,000 workers faced uncertain paychecks. Federal investigators were building criminal cases, and Frank was discovering that success in business requires more than just family loyalty and educational credentials. Wednesday morning brought the inevitable reckoning that Frank had been avoiding since Monday. I arrived at the office of Patricia Walsh, the employment attorney who specialized in wrongful termination cases involving professional women in male-dominated industries. Her downtown office overlooked the same construction projects where Brookstone workers were threatening to walk off their jobs. Patricia was a formidable woman in her late 40s, with silver hair pulled back in a professional bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had built her reputation defending skilled professionals who were pushed aside by incompetent management decisions. Her office walls displayed law degrees from Michigan and Harvard, along with photos from high-profile cases she had won against major corporations. Celeste, I've reviewed the documentation you provided, and this case represents several clear violations of employment law. Patricia began spreading papers across her mahogany desk. First, your termination appears to be based on gender and age discrimination, disguised as modernization. Second, the company's failure to provide adequate transition time suggests intentional sabotage of operations to justify your removal. She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. But the most compelling aspect is the catastrophic failure that resulted from replacing your expertise with someone who lacks basic qualifications. This demonstrates that your termination was arbitrary and damaging to both employees and the company itself. Patricia had spent the morning reviewing federal labor violations that were piling up at Brookstone. Celeste, the Department of Labor investigation creates a perfect opportunity to demonstrate the direct connection between your wrongful termination and the company's legal problems. When they removed you, they removed the only person capable of ensuring federal compliance. At that moment, my phone rang. Frank's number appeared on the screen, and Patricia gestured for me to answer while she listened. Celeste. Frank's voice was strained and desperate, completely different from the confident tone he had used on Friday. I need to talk to you about coming back. We're having some challenges with the transition, and I think we might benefit from your expertise during this adjustment period. Frank, are you asking me to fix the problems that Bradley created? Look, I'm not saying Bradley made mistakes, but maybe the timeline was too aggressive. Maybe we need a longer transition period with more overlap between your systems and his approaches. Patricia shook her head and handed me a notepad with her response written out: full reinstatement with enhanced authority and compensation, plus removal of Bradley from all payroll responsibilities. Frank, I'm not interested in helping Bradley learn how to do my job. If you want my expertise, you need to offer full reinstatement with complete authority over payroll operations, enhanced compensation reflecting my proven value, and guaranteed employment protection, preventing future arbitrary termination. Frank was quiet for several seconds. Celeste, that seems extreme. Can't we work something out that allows both you and Bradley to contribute? Maybe you could train him while he gradually takes over more responsibilities. Frank Bradley has proven he's incapable of handling construction payroll. He's created federal violations that could destroy your company. I'm not going to spend my time cleaning up his disasters while he takes credit for my work. What if we increased your salary and gave you a supervisory role over Bradley? Patricia wrote another note. He doesn't understand the magnitude of his legal exposure. Frank, you're facing potential criminal charges for willful wage theft. The Department of Labor investigation could result in federal prosecution. Your largest client is reconsidering your contracts. Workers are threatening strikes across 5 states. This isn't about supervisory roles or salary increases. This is about survival. Frank's voice became pleading. Celeste, your family. Helen is my niece. We can work this out without involving lawyers or making demands that hurt the business. Frank, When you fired me, you made it clear that family relationships don't protect professional competence. Now that your business is collapsing, you can't suddenly claim family loyalty as a reason for me to save you. After I ended the call, Patricia outlined the legal strategy that would force Frank to acknowledge the full extent of his mistake. Celeste, we're going to file comprehensive complaints with multiple agencies. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission will investigate gender and age discrimination. The Department of Labor will examine the connection between your termination and the subsequent federal violations. The State Labor Board will review the impact on worker payments. What about my documentation of the ongoing violations? That's crucial evidence. Your records prove that these weren't honest mistakes or system glitches. These were predictable failures that resulted directly from replacing qualified management with someone who lacked basic competence. Patricia's phone rang, and she answered with her professional demeanor. Patricia Walsh speaking. The caller was Marcus Williams, whose voice was loud enough for me to hear. Ms. Walsh, this is Marcus Williams from Local 407. I understand you're representing Celeste Rodriguez. I wanted you to know that our union is voting today on immediate work stoppages at all Brookstone projects. We're also filing federal complaints alleging systematic wage theft. Marcus, thank you for calling. Your union's actions will strengthen our case by demonstrating the direct impact of Celeste's wrongful termination on worker rights and federal compliance. Ms. Walsh, our members are missing hundreds of thousands of dollars in wages and benefits. This isn't just about one person's job. This is about protecting working families from management incompetence. After Marcus hung up, Patricia explained how the multiple legal actions would create overwhelming pressure on Frank to resolve the crisis quickly and completely. Celeste, when companies face simultaneous federal investigations, union actions, and wrongful termination lawsuits, they usually choose settlement over prolonged litigation. At 2 o'clock, Diana called with news that the crisis had reached its breaking point. Celeste Bradley just had a complete meltdown. He spent all night trying to fix the payroll calculations, but he made everything worse. He accidentally corrupted the main database and deleted the backup files. Frank is screaming at him. Sandra is threatening criminal referrals, and Marcus is organizing picketing for tomorrow morning. Diana, what about the backup systems? That's the problem. Bradley saved over the only backup files when he was trying to fix his mistakes. 10 years of carefully maintained payroll records are gone forever. Unless someone has independent backup systems, Brookstone can't pay anyone on Friday. Patricia smiled grimly. Celeste, did you maintain independent backup systems? Of course I did. I learned early never to trust company systems completely. I have secure personal backups of all critical data updated through last Friday. Perfect. That means you hold the only key to resolving this crisis. Frank needs your expertise, your backup systems, and your knowledge of federal compliance procedures. You're not just an employee he wrongfully terminated. You're the only person who can save his company. The climactic moment arrived when Helen, my wife, called to tell me that Frank's other family members were pressuring him to resolve the crisis before it permanently destroyed the family business. Celeste, Frank's brother, called this morning asking what happened to you. When I explained the situation, he said Frank had made the stupidest decision in company history. The family is worried that Frank's pride will bankrupt everyone. Helen's voice carried both support and concern. Honey, I know you're angry and you have every right to be. But if you can use this situation to get the recognition and protection you deserve, maybe something good can come from Frank's terrible judgment. As Wednesday evening approached, I realized that Frank's attempt to modernize through family favoritism had created a perfect opportunity to demonstrate my true professional value. Bradley's spectacular failure had proven that experience and competence couldn't be replaced by educational credentials and family connections. Friday morning loomed with the promise of chaos if Frank continued refusing to acknowledge his mistake. Workers across 5 states depended on my expertise to receive their paychecks, and Frank's pride was the only obstacle to resolving the crisis he had created. Thursday morning arrived with the force of a legal tsunami that Frank could no longer ignore or deflect. I sat in Patricia Walsh's conference room surrounded by documentation that proved my case beyond any reasonable doubt. Patricia had spent the night preparing a comprehensive legal offensive that would force Frank to choose between his pride and his company's survival. Celeste, we're filing simultaneously with 4 different agencies this morning, Patricia explained, organizing stacks of legal documents. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission will investigate gender and age discrimination. The Department of Labor will examine the connection between your termination and federal compliance failures. The State Attorney General will review potential criminal violations, and the federal prosecutor will consider racketeering charges under the RICO Act. Patricia's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than attacking Frank directly, she was demonstrating that his decision to fire me had created a pattern of federal violations that threatened the company's existence. Celeste, by tomorrow afternoon, Frank will face potential criminal prosecution, federal investigation, union strikes, and client cancellations. He'll realize that restoring you to full authority is his only path to survival. At 9 o'clock, Marcus called with news that Local 407 had voted unanimously for immediate work stoppages beginning Monday morning. Celeste, our members can't afford to work for a company that doesn't pay them correctly. We're also organizing solidarity strikes with electrical workers, operating engineers, and carpenters. By Monday, Brookstone will have no workers on any projects in 5 states. Marcus's voice carried grim determination. Our lawyers filed complaints this morning with the Department of Justice alleging systematic wage theft under federal racketeering statutes. When companies steal wages from thousands of workers across multiple states, that's organized crime under federal law. The legal pressure was building from multiple directions, but the most devastating blow came when Helen called to tell me about the family meeting that had taken place Wednesday night. Celeste, Frank's brother David, flew in from California, and Frank's sister came up from Florida. They're terrified that Frank's stubbornness will bankrupt the family business and destroy everyone's retirement security. Helen had been my partner for 8 years, supporting my career through the challenges of working in a male-dominated industry. Her voice carried both love and fierce protectiveness. Honey, they all know that firing you was the stupidest decision Frank ever made. David told Frank that replacing expertise with nepotism was business suicide. Frank's sister said that if he doesn't fix this immediately, the family will remove him from company leadership. At noon, Diana called with news that Pinnacle Development had delivered an ultimatum that would determine Brookstone's fate. Celeste, Pinnacle's executives met with Frank this morning, and they're furious about the payroll crisis. They told Frank that if worker payments aren't corrected by Friday afternoon, they'll cancel all 3 projects and demand immediate repayment of advance funds. Diana, how much money are we talking about? $52 million in active contracts, plus $14 million in advance payments that would have to be returned immediately. Celeste, if Pinnacle cancels, Brookstone goes bankrupt within 30 days. Diana's voice dropped to a whisper. Frank looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He kept asking Bradley if the payroll could be fixed by Friday, and Bradley just kept saying he needed more time to understand the systems. Frank finally yelled at him that there is no more time. Patricia received a call from Sandra Mitchell, the Department of Labor investigator, who wanted to discuss the criminal referrals she was preparing. Ms. Walsh, I've completed my investigation into the Brookstone payroll violations, and I'm recommending criminal prosecution under federal wage theft statutes. The violations are so extensive and systematic that they suggest willful criminal conduct. Patricia put the call on speaker so I could hear. Sandra, my client Celeste Rodriguez was the payroll manager who maintained perfect compliance until she was wrongfully terminated last Friday. The violations began immediately after her removal and resulted directly from replacing her expertise with someone who lacks basic qualifications. I understand that, Ms. Walsh. Ms. Rodriguez's historical files are exemplary, but my investigation focuses on current violations, not personnel decisions. The company is liable for criminal prosecution regardless of why the violations occurred. Patricia leaned forward. Sandra, would the criminal referrals be reconsidered if the company restored Ms. Rodriguez to full authority and corrected all violations immediately? That might affect the prosecutor's charging decisions, but I can't make guarantees. The violations are severe enough to warrant prosecution even if they're corrected. After Sandra hung up, Patricia explained how the criminal threat would force Frank to accept our demands completely. Celeste, Frank faces personal criminal liability for the wage theft violations. Restoring you to authority and correcting the violations immediately is his only hope of avoiding prosecution. The afternoon brought the decisive moment when Frank called, his voice completely different from our previous conversations. Gone was the confident authority of a successful businessman. In its place was the desperate pleading of someone facing the destruction of everything he had built. Celeste, I need to meet with you immediately. I think we need to discuss how to resolve this situation quickly and completely. Frank, I'm available to meet, but only with my attorney present, and only if you're prepared to discuss full restoration of my position with enhanced authority and compensation. Celeste, I understand that you deserve recognition for your expertise. What would it take for you to help us get through this crisis? Patricia handed me a notepad with our demands: full reinstatement as payroll director with enhanced authority, 25% salary increase, Bradley removed from all payroll responsibilities, guaranteed employment protection, and public acknowledgement of wrongful termination. Frank, I want full reinstatement as payroll director with complete authority over all payroll operations. I want a 25% salary increase reflecting my proven expertise. I want Bradley permanently removed from any payroll responsibilities. I want guaranteed employment protection, preventing future arbitrary termination. And I want public acknowledgement that my termination was a mistake. Frank was quiet for 30 seconds. Celeste, those terms seem excessive for what was essentially a communication failure. Frank, you're facing criminal prosecution for wage theft union strikes across 5 states, client cancellations worth $52 million, and potential bankruptcy. My terms aren't excessive. They're the minimum price for saving your company. The climactic moment arrived when Frank finally understood that his pride had created a crisis that threatened his family's entire legacy. Celeste, if I agree to your terms, can you guarantee that the payroll will be corrected by Friday and that the legal problems will go away? Frank, I can guarantee that I'll restore proper payroll functions immediately. I can't guarantee that federal prosecutors will drop criminal investigations, but cooperation and immediate correction might influence their charging decisions. Patricia added, Mr. Hoffman, the longer this crisis continues, the more damage accumulates. Every day of delay increases the criminal exposure and the financial liability. Acting decisively today is your only path to minimizing the consequences of your mistake. As Thursday evening approached, I realized that Frank's attempt to replace experience with family loyalty had created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my irreplaceable value. His pride had nearly destroyed his company, but now that pride would force him to acknowledge publicly that some expertise cannot be replaced by educational credentials or family connections, Friday morning would bring either complete vindication or total disaster, and the choice was entirely in Frank's hands. Friday morning brought the moment of truth that would determine whether Frank's pride was stronger than his survival instinct. I arrived at Brookstone Construction at 7 o'clock, accompanied by Patricia Walsh and carrying the backup drives that contained the only viable path forward for the company. Frank stood waiting in the lobby, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the hollow exhaustion of someone who had spent the night facing the reality of his catastrophic mistake. The conference room was packed with people whose careers and livelihoods hung in the balance. Marcus Williams sat with 3 other union representatives, their expressions grim but hopeful. Diana had arrived early along with Jenny and several other office staff who understood the technical complexity of what needed to be accomplished. Bradley sat alone at one end of the table, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident arrogance replaced by obvious defeat. Frank cleared his throat, his voice lacking its usual authority. I want to start by acknowledging that the payroll transition this week didn't go as smoothly as we had hoped. There have been some challenges that require immediate attention, and I think it's important that we address them directly and honestly. Marcus interrupted immediately. Frank, let's be clear about what happened here. You fired the most competent payroll manager in the region and replaced her with someone who has no business handling construction payroll. Our members are missing hundreds of thousands of dollars in wages, and you're calling that a transition that didn't go smoothly. Patricia stood and addressed the room with the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for professional women. Mr. Hoffman, my client Celeste Rodriguez, was wrongfully terminated despite 10 years of exemplary performance. The payroll crisis that resulted from her termination has created federal violations, union grievances, and potential criminal liability. We're here today to discuss the complete restoration of Ms. Rodriguez's position and authority. Frank looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. Celeste, I want to apologize publicly for the way this transition was handled. It's clear that we underestimated the complexity of the payroll operations and the importance of your specialized knowledge. I'm asking you to return as payroll director with full authority to correct the problems that have developed this week. Frank, I appreciate the apology, but I need to hear your complete acknowledgement of what went wrong and what changes you're making to prevent this from happening again. Frank's face flushed, but he continued, "You're right. I made a serious error in judgment by replacing experienced management with someone who wasn't adequately prepared for the responsibilities. I was influenced by family relationships instead of focusing on professional qualifications. The result has been a disaster that threatened our workers, our clients, and our company." Bradley started to speak, but Frank cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Bradley, you're going to listen to what I have to say without interrupting. You convinced me that your MBA education qualified you to handle complex payroll operations, but you were completely wrong. You've created federal violations that could send me to prison, union grievances that could shut down our operations, and client complaints that could bankrupt our company." Frank turned back to me. "Celeste, I'm offering you immediate reinstatement as payroll director with a 25% salary increase, complete authority over all payroll operations, and guaranteed employment protection. Bradley will be removed from any payroll responsibilities and assigned to other duties where his education might be more appropriate." Marcus leaned forward. "Frank, what about the workers who didn't get paid correctly this week? How are you going to make them whole?" "Celeste will have full authority to calculate the correct payments, including penalties for the delayed compensation. Every worker will receive their proper wages plus additional compensation for the errors and delays." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Mr. Hoffman, we also need your acknowledgement that Ms. Rodriguez's termination was wrongful and that her expertise is essential to the company's federal compliance obligations." Frank's voice was strained but clear. "Celeste's termination was a mistake that resulted from poor judgment and family favoritism. Her expertise in construction payroll is irreplaceable, and the company's compliance with federal regulations depends on her knowledge and experience." The moment everyone had been waiting for arrived when I stood to address the room. "I accept Frank's offer of reinstatement with the enhanced authority and compensation he's outlined. I want everyone to understand that correcting the payroll problems will require several days of intensive work, but I'm committed to ensuring that every worker receives their correct wages as quickly as possible." I looked directly at Bradley. "Bradley, I hope you've learned something about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Construction payroll isn't just about calculating numbers. It's about understanding complex regulations, union agreements, and worker rights. Those skills develop through years of experience, not months of education." Bradley's face was red, but he nodded reluctantly. "I underestimated the complexity of the systems you built. I thought my education had prepared me for any business challenge, but I was wrong. I'm sorry for the problems I created." Marcus stood and extended his hand to me. "Celeste, our members are grateful that you're back. We'll call off the strike authorization and work with you to resolve the payment issues. But we want guarantees that this kind of management failure won't happen again." "Marcus, you have my commitment that payroll operations will return to the professional standards we maintained for the past 10 years. I've learned some valuable lessons about protecting the systems and expertise that workers depend on." Diana smiled for the first time all week. "Celeste, I've already started preparing the correction calculations using the backup files you provided. We should be able to process corrected payments by Monday afternoon." The climactic transformation occurred when Frank publicly acknowledged the magnitude of his mistake and the irreplaceable value of specialized expertise. "I want everyone in this room to understand that what happened this week represents a failure of leadership on my part. I allowed personal relationships to override professional judgment, and the result nearly destroyed everything we've built together." Frank looked at his son with obvious disappointment. "Bradley, you're going to spend the next 6 months learning about construction operations from the ground up. You'll work on job sites, learn about union agreements, and study federal compliance requirements. If you want to contribute to this company, you need to understand the business from the worker's perspective." Patricia concluded the meeting by outlining the legal protections that would prevent future arbitrary personnel decisions. "Mr. Hoffman has agreed to implement formal policies requiring professional justification for any management changes affecting federal compliance obligations. This ensures that expertise and experience will be valued appropriately in future decisions." As the meeting ended, I realized that Frank's attempt to modernize through family favoritism had ultimately strengthened my position and demonstrated the irreplaceable value of specialized knowledge. His pride had nearly destroyed his company, but the crisis had forced him to acknowledge publicly that some expertise cannot be replaced by educational credentials or family connections. The disaster was over, but the lessons learned would protect both the company and its workers for years to come. Professional competence had triumphed over nepotism, and 16,000 workers could continue, depending on accurate, timely paychecks processed by someone who understood the true complexity of their needs. 1 month after the crisis that nearly destroyed Brookstone Construction, I sat in my newly expanded office reviewing the transformation that had emerged from Frank's catastrophic mistake. The events of that terrible week had fundamentally changed not just my position within the company, but the entire industry's understanding of the specialized expertise required for construction payroll management. My title was now Director of Payroll Operations, with authority extending beyond simple payroll processing to include federal compliance oversight, union relations management, and system security protocols. The 25% salary increase Frank had offered during our reconciliation meeting was just the beginning of the recognition my expertise had finally received. The most satisfying change was the independent consulting company I had established during my brief unemployment. Patricia Walsh had helped me create Rodriguez Payroll Consulting, specializing in construction payroll systems for mid-sized contractors who needed professional expertise but couldn't afford full-time specialists. Frank became my first major client, paying substantially for the consulting services that protected Brookstone from future compliance disasters. The irony was perfect. Frank had fired me to save money on payroll management, only to end up paying significantly more for the same expertise delivered through my independent consulting firm. But the arrangement worked for everyone. I maintained my primary role at Brookstone, while building a reputation throughout the region as the expert who could solve complex construction payroll challenges. Helen smiled whenever I described my new professional status. "Honey, you went from being an employee Frank could fire on a whim to being a consultant he can't afford to lose. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened." The changes extended beyond my personal situation to meaningful improvements throughout the company. Frank had implemented formal policies requiring professional justification for any personnel decisions affecting federal compliance. No longer could family relationships or educational credentials override demonstrated expertise and proven performance. Bradley's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. Instead of sulking about his demotion, he had embraced Frank's requirement that he learn the construction business from the ground up. He spent his mornings working on job sites, learning about the physical demands and safety requirements that influenced payroll calculations. His afternoons were devoted to studying union agreements and federal regulations under my direct supervision. "Celeste, I want to apologize again for the arrogance I showed when I first arrived," Bradley said during one of our weekly training sessions. "I thought my MBA had prepared me for any business challenge, but I had no idea how much I didn't know. Construction payroll is like a foreign language that requires years to master." Bradley's humility was genuine, born from the harsh reality of watching his mistakes nearly destroy his family's business. "I've learned that theoretical knowledge and practical expertise are completely different things. You can't manage what you don't understand, and you can't understand complex operations through textbooks or classroom lectures." The most rewarding aspect of the transformation was the mentoring program I established for other women in construction administration. Too many companies undervalued specialized expertise, particularly when that expertise was held by women in male-dominated industries. My experience had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of replacing competence with nepotism or gender bias. Sarah Chen was my first mentee, a recent accounting graduate who wanted to specialize in construction payroll. She possessed the analytical skills and attention to detail required for the work, but she needed guidance in navigating the political challenges of proving herself in an industry that often dismissed women's expertise. "Sarah, the most important lesson I can teach you is to document everything and maintain independent backup systems," I explained during one of our training sessions. "Your expertise is valuable, but you need to protect yourself against management decisions based on bias rather than competence." Sarah absorbed the technical knowledge quickly, but I also shared the political wisdom I had gained through years of experience. Never assume that good performance will be automatically recognized or protected. Build relationships with union representatives, federal inspectors, and client managers who can verify your expertise independently. The industry recognition that followed the Brookstone crisis exceeded my expectations. Marcus Williams recommended my consulting services to other union locals, leading to contracts with construction companies across the Midwest. Federal investigators who had worked the Brookstone case referred colleagues who needed expert witnesses for other compliance investigations. Celeste, your documentation and analysis of the Brookstone violations helped us understand how quickly competent operations can deteriorate under incompetent management. Sandra Mitchell told me during a consulting engagement, "Your expertise is becoming legendary in federal compliance circles." The local press followed up on their original coverage of the Brookstone crisis with a feature article about my successful resolution of the problems. "Construction Payroll Expert Saves Company from Federal Prosecution" ran as the headline, accompanied by interviews with workers who praised my expertise and union representatives who emphasized the importance of specialized knowledge in protecting worker rights. The article quoted Marcus extensively. "Celeste Rodriguez represents the kind of professional expertise that makes the difference between successful operations and federal violations. Companies that don't value specialized knowledge do so at their own peril." Frank's public acknowledgement of his mistake had spread throughout the industry, creating opportunities for me to speak at construction management conferences about the importance of valuing expertise over favoritism. The biggest lesson from our crisis was that some knowledge cannot be replaced by educational credentials or family relationships. I told an audience of construction executives, specialized expertise develops through years of experience, and companies that ignore that reality face catastrophic consequences. Helen often accompanied me to these speaking engagements, proud of the professional recognition I had finally received. "Honey, you're not just fixing payroll problems anymore. You're changing how the entire industry thinks about professional expertise and gender bias in management decisions." The speaking engagements led to board positions with professional organizations that advocated for women in construction administration. My experience had become a case study in how wrongful termination could backfire spectacularly when it removed essential expertise from complex operations. As I reflected on the transformation that had emerged from Frank's terrible judgment, I realized that the worst professional crisis of my life had ultimately become the foundation for unprecedented career success. The attempt to replace my expertise with Bradley's education had demonstrated conclusively that theoretical knowledge and practical competence were fundamentally different qualifications. Frank's family favoritism had nearly destroyed his company, but the resulting crisis had forced him to acknowledge publicly the irreplaceable value of specialized expertise. Workers across 5 states had learned that their paychecks depended on professional competence, not management politics. The most important lesson was about the courage required to stand up for professional value, even when that meant challenging family relationships and corporate hierarchies. My refusal to accept wrongful termination quietly had protected not just my own career, but the financial security of 16,000 workers who deserved accurate paychecks processed by qualified professionals. 6 months after the crisis, Bradley approached me with a proposal that demonstrated how completely the situation had transformed. "Celeste, I've been working with a group of MBA students who want to study construction payroll management. Would you consider developing a curriculum that combines business education with practical expertise?" The request was deeply satisfying. The same educational arrogance that had nearly destroyed Brookstone was now seeking guidance from the practical expertise it had previously dismissed. "Bradley, I'd be happy to help develop that curriculum, but the students need to understand that construction payroll management requires years of hands-on experience, not just classroom theory." As I prepared to close this chapter of my professional life and move forward with expanded opportunities, I wanted to share the most important lessons with others who might face similar challenges. Professional expertise built through years of dedicated experience cannot be replaced by theoretical knowledge or personal relationships. Companies that value education over competence or family connections over professional qualifications risk catastrophic failures that threaten their survival. Standing up for professional value requires courage, but the alternative is accepting a system that undervalues specialized knowledge and puts workers at risk. My experience proved that wrongful termination based on bias or favoritism can backfire dramatically when it removes essential expertise from complex operations. The construction industry learned that payroll management is far more complex than simple arithmetic requiring deep understanding of federal regulations, union agreements, and worker rights. 16,000 workers learned that their financial security depends on professional competence, not management politics. Most importantly, I learned that the worst professional crisis can become the foundation for unprecedented success when you refuse to accept injustice quietly and insist on recognition for your true value. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your expertise was undervalued or dismissed? How did you stand up for your professional worth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please like this video. If my experience resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about overcoming workplace challenges, and share this with anyone who might be facing similar struggles with recognition and respect. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your expertise has value even when others fail to recognize it. Stay strong, stay professional, and never let anyone convince you that experience can be replaced by anything other than more experience.